Hello, everyone. My name is Giza Lopez. I am the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. Let me start by welcoming each of you to our Lunch and Learn webinar series. I took a break from being an MC here, and it's such a pleasure to be back in this space and welcome all of you. We appreciate very much that you're making time during your lunch break, more likely, to learn about youth justice research. If you feel like it, please indulge me and add your name to the chat. Tell us where you're from. And if you feel inclined, let us know what's your favorite season. It's a beautiful fall day here in New York right now, but I know that not all of you are tuning in from New York. So we would love to hear what your favorite season is and what your day is going like wherever you are. Anyways, I want to express my thanks also to our wonderful partners in New York State, especially the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the CJS, and the University at Albany. Without their institutional support, we would not be here. It is my pleasure, and I told her earlier that I am #fangirl of all of her work, to be the first here to introduce Dr. Sara Wakefield, who is a giant name in the field of criminal justice and research. It is our pleasure to have you here, Sara. And I'll be joined right now by our wonderful Director of Research, Dr. Jen Vanderminden, who will be working as the facilitator of what promises to be an incredible conversation today. Jen, on to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Jen Vanderminden, and I'm the Director of Research for the Youth Justice Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Sara Wakefield is a professor of criminal justice at Rutgers University, Newark, and a graduate affiliate faculty member in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers, New Brunswick. She received her PhD in from the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. Her research interests focus on the consequences of mass imprisonment for the family, with an emphasis on childhood well-being and racial inequality, culminating in a series of articles in a book, Children of the Prison Boom, Mass Incarceration, and the Future of American Inequality. She has a series of team-based projects to provide original data on the consequences of contact with the criminal legal system that are not easily captured in available data sets. Recent demographic analysis estimate the number of people in the United States with a felony conviction and the prevalence of termination of parental rights among U.S. children. Her current work is focused on sibling overlap in crime, punishment, and the consequences of criminal legal system contact. We are excited for her to lead today's discussion on her research regarding sibling relationships and systems contact. Without further ado, Dr. Wakefield, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Everyone can hear me, I assume. I hope. Yay. Okay. All right. I'm going to share my screen and start a talk, but I first wanted to just say how happy I am to be here, in particular with this audience. I'm going to talk about siblings, crime and punishment, and I'm going to give you some answers to some questions that I will pose, but I'm also going to pose a number of questions that I don't know the answers to. And so this audience in particular, if you can weigh in the chat, I would love to know sort of what else I should be looking at. And so this for me is just a really important opportunity, and I'm excited to be here. I want to first just give you a roadmap, and I promise I will be brief. I'm going to give you some resources and introductory comments, and I'm going to talk about sort of why siblings are understudied among sociologists and criminologists in the kind of criminal justice space. I'll show you a little bit of information on gaps in the literature, and then tell you about two studies that I have done. And then again, I'd love to open it up for questions and feedback and advice, because this is very much an ongoing research stream for me. If we could put up the first poll for the audience, I should say I'm interested in siblings as an intellectual matter, but I think all of us kind of come to our research interests by our own experiences. And for me, siblings are interesting to me. I have an older brother, but we were raised in separate households. I always think about myself as, am I a youngest or an only child? Because I have experiences that I think fit both of those sorts of narratives. And so I come to this with just an interest in sort of how siblings interact over the life course, driven by my own experience with a beloved older brother. Um, so I'm looking at sort of this poll, and I'm asking sort of, where do you fit in your family system? How do you think about your own siblings? And what I'd like for you to be thinking about is how complex that is. That our ways of measuring family complexity leave a lot to be desired. The slide that's up on the screen, I'm going to talk about two papers that I've provided to the hosts. They can put it in the chat if they'd like, if you'd like to read the papers. And then I'll just say that what I find interesting is that I have 3 additional co-authors on these projects, and we all fit in different places in our sibling relationships. So Garrett Baker, who's a graduate student at Duke, is an oldest. He's, of course, the most responsible of the group as a result. Chris Wilderman is an only child and thus an attention seeker. I'm a youngest child and the one who plays pranks, and Robert Apel, who also is working on this, is a middle child and does not like any attention whatsoever. So we often joke that our research team is enacting sibling relationships in interesting ways. So we have a lot of firstborns on the chat, and a lot of middle children. So thinking about how that might affect your own family systems is a good way to start engaging this research. I want to just talk a little bit about kind of what I notice in I guess I'm sharing the results. Am I sharing the results? I think so. We're about a third firstborns and a third middle children and some youngest children and very few only children. So most people have siblings, I think, is the other thing. Um, I just want to talk a little bit about what sort of sibling research looks like in the criminology space. There's a great book from the 1930s that follows 5 brothers in Chicago and sort of talks about how they became involved in crime. It's very much in keeping with research in criminology that's focused on neighborhoods and focused on family systems. So there's this wonderful book published in 1938, and you can kind of trace interest in family life, interest in neighborhoods from that period in criminology. But sibling interest didn't keep up. Nobody took that interest in siblings and carried it through the decades to today. So what criminology looks like is sort of a couple of papers that sort of pop up every decade or so. Those papers are almost always interested in the question of, if one sibling is involved in crime, what's the likelihood that another is? And that's an important question, but I think I hope to convince you that it's a pretty narrow question, and there are lots of others to be answered. Criminologists have typically treated siblings as sort of a special case of peer, so kind of like a friend, but not really. Most papers have some assumption of learning processes between siblings, so like an older brother teaching a younger brother how to do crime. And again, I think that work is really important, but there are many, many other questions to be asked. There are also very few studies on what it means for a family system to have one child involved in the criminal legal system, even if another child doesn't become involved themselves. And this, I think, is most notably important because if we're only looking at sort of crimi overlap between siblings, sisters get ignored. Kids, outcomes for kids that really aren't about crime really get ignored. And so that's sort of what the literature looks like. The other interest for me is in 2019, I did a survey on family incarceration, which is mostly what I study. And I wanted to know with a bunch of other co-authors, like, what percentage of Americans have ever had a family member incarcerated? And the answer is 45%. But what was interesting to me, and this finding got tons of news coverage, like it was all over the place, but nobody said anything about what was the most interesting finding to me, which was that sibling incarceration is the modal form of family incarceration experience in this country. And so the lack of research on that issue seems to me to be a real problem. The other thing, digging more into this, I think we spend tons of time thinking about how parents influence children, and of course that's important. But American children spend more time living with a sibling than with a father figure today. So the idea that we're not paying attention to that relationship to the degree that we could, I think is important. Just to sort of prove it to you, diving into this, Garrett Baker, who's my collaborator on much of this, came up with these figures, and he basically looked at the top journals in criminology, in sociology, and developmental psychology, just to get a sense of like where do siblings fit. And so these are graphs of the number of abstracts that mention either parents, peers, or siblings. The red lines are siblings. Nobody's studying siblings to the degree that they're studying peers or to the degree that they're studying parents. So I think there's a lot to know. And this is why I am so excited for this particular audience, because I think my field has not done a great job of producing good research on this topic, and there are tons of people with on the ground experience with these sorts of problems. So I really want to hear what you all see and what else I should be looking at. So I hope I've convinced you it's sort of perhaps worthy of study. It's always possible that we don't study things because they're not important. But I think this one is. And there's a couple of things I would say. First, the research literature has not done a great job of distinguishing between criminal offending and criminal legal system contact. And I think in the era of mass incarceration, we've started to better understand that those two things are related, but also separate. So we often, old research would refer to criminal legal system contact as if it were the same thing as offending, or vice versa. So I think distinguishing between those things is important. I think a lot of the literature also assumes that sibling incarceration is going to look exactly the same way as parental incarceration. And one of my favorite things is to play with ChatGPT, which is an AI platform. And so I asked ChatGPT, to tell me about research on sibling incarceration, and it made up a bunch of citations and also told me that I had been studying sibling incarceration for a decade and then just changed my citations. So it lied to me. But I thought that assumption, I think, was right, that that having a parent incarcerated or a parent involved in crime might not necessarily work out the same way as a sibling. The other thing I would say is that there are other fields and other disciplines that have been studying siblings for forever. And if we could put the second poll up right now, that'll get me to my point here. But that research essentially shows that big events kind of spare no one. So if you think about your own life, if you have a sibling who had great difficulty, what impact did that have on you that might be hard for people to see? Research also shows that the kinds of things that we think about with families as being rare are actually pretty common. So favoritism, for example, if you have siblings and you think about your parents, my brother and I probably could tell you whose favorite we are among our parents, and that, I think, is something that is common, and research shows that that's common. It need not be, devastating, but I think is important to account for. We can also think about research on the number of children parents have and how they're able to devote attention in that way. And so in this poll, I've asked you to think about your relationship with a sibling and describe it. And here we have, so more than half of you describe that relationship as close. I think that's important to pay attention to. Sibling estrangement is pretty uncommon. Some of you have described your relationship as competitive. That is also common, even in relationships that are close. Cordial, right? May depend on your sort of life stage, how close you live to your sibling. And we have 10% here who have said estranged. So it's not that it never happens, but it rarely happens. So siblings affect all of us throughout the life course in dramatic and mundane ways. And it's really hard for us to measure something as complex as that relationship in a very simple way. And I think the other thing that I would call your attention to is that we tend to describe sibling relationships as one kind of thing. So we can think about, siblings as controls on each other, siblings as kind of like peers, siblings as role models, or siblings as cautionary tales. So imagine an older sibling becoming involved in the criminal legal system. That could be a modeling kind of experience, but it also could be, well, I don't want to do that because I don't want that to happen to me. And all of those things are going on at once. And our data sources are just sort of not up to measuring that sort of complexity. So this is what brings me to the topic. I want to just give you sort of two empirical examples and then open it up to questions. The first one is a study that may have shown up in the chat, and I'm happy to provide it for people. This came out in the Journal of Marriage and the Family. And the research question here was simply, does the criminal legal system contact of one sibling influence the well-being and family life of another? And the goal for that study was to simply say that it is an important question to figure out whether siblings offend together, whether siblings are learning crime from each other. But it's also important to figure out other impacts. And that was not well represented in the literature. So we do a couple of things. We in that paper, we make an argument that we shouldn't only be looking at incarceration. Many people on the webinar today I know are working with juvenile populations. The sort of long draconian sentences for very young people get a lot of public attention, but I think most of us know that you have a lot of context before you end up in prison. So it doesn't make sense to only study incarceration for siblings. We also, I think, wanted to distinguish between fallout for kids versus their parents and households. So we include multiple measures of those things. And we don't assume that it'll work out the same way as parental incarceration. So we have some sense that this should matter, but not strong hypotheses about how it should matter. So here's what we did. I studied parental incarceration for decades, 2 decades at least. And so I picked the outcomes that are most common in that literature and where we have a lot of information. These are the 3 we looked at. We looked at child well-being, which is essentially internalizing problems, so things like anxiety and depression, externalizing problems like aggression and delinquency, and then a sum of both. We then looked at how the child in our study and their caregivers perceive social support. This is not a measure of stigma, but it's as close as we could come. So what does it mean for people in the family to have one sibling in a system have criminal legal system contact? So these are a series of questions about people's perceptions of the help that they receive from friends and family. And then the last two outcomes are important because we find different things for them. So I just want to go through them really quickly. The first is financial insecurity, and this is essentially whether or not your household moves below the poverty line and it has access to government resources as a result. That outcome makes sense if you lose, say, a parent to prison and thus lose their income and your household income changes. It's not clear to us that that should work out the same way with siblings because they're usually not contributing to the household income. So we also measure material insecurity, which is the extent to which your budget is stretched. So this is stuff like, are you having trouble buying groceries? Are you having trouble paying the heating bill? Those sorts of things that really aren't about getting access to government resources. And here's what we find. In most ways, sibling incarceration seems to work out in much the same way that parental incarceration does for kids. So in a bunch of households, we take one child who we refer to as the focal child. We look at whether or not that child reports a sibling having criminal legal system contact of any form, arrest, conviction, incarceration, and then what they look like after that event. And afterwards, that focal child typically demonstrates greater externalizing problems, so things like aggression and delinquency, greater total problems, which I think is just driven by the externalizing result. And both caregivers and children report greater material insecurity, so budgets being stretched. Going to court is costly, right? That should make sense. We also find that both the child and the caregiver report very large declines in the social support that is available to them. So they feel as if friends and family are not there to help in a way that they used to be. And then we find no effects for internalizing problems like depression or anxiety, and no effects for financial insecurity. So what does that mean? It simply means that if we care about parental incarceration, we should probably care about sibling criminal legal system contact, because it seems to work out in pretty similar ways. The second study, which I'm going to be really fast on because I think I'm probably running out of time, is this is what we're doing now, is we're trying to sort of go back and redo some of that classic criminology, looking at sibling crime and criminal legal system overlap. So simply, what are the increases or decreases in odds for siblings if they have a sibling who is either involved in crime or involved in the criminal legal system? So we're trying to deal with that question in contexts where there's greater family complexity. So many more siblings today, many more step siblings today than decades ago. We're also trying to treat criminal offending and criminal legal system contact as separate but related experiences. And I'll just tell you what we've found so far. We're finding overlaps that are pretty similar to research in decades past. So increases in crime. If one sibling is involved in crime, there's a slight increase that another sibling is also involved in crime in a subsequent round of data collection. We also see increases of matching criminal legal system contact. So if a sibling is arrested, what's the likelihood that a focal child in our study is arrested? And these are fairly large increases. The other thing that we've completed, though, is to ask whether one thing is fully explained by the other. So one question you might have is, if I have a sibling who's involved in the criminal legal system, is the problem the criminal legal system involvement, or is it that sibling's behavior? And that's something to be concerned about. And what we're finding is that they work independently, and that both of them are important. So studies that only measure things like arrest or incarceration are missing the behavioral piece. Studies that are only looking at behavior are missing the kind of fallout of criminal legal system contact for a family system. That's in progress. We're now going to start looking at racial and ethnic differences, at gender, so sisters, brothers, mixed sex pairings, half siblings. And the idea is to really update the literature on these questions in an era of much greater family complexity and much greater use of the criminal legal system. Okay, that was a lot. So I want to just wrap up and hear your feedback. And again, I said at the outset that I was going to raise many more questions than I can answer, and I hope I've maybe done that, because I'd also love your wisdom on this. I hope that I've convinced you that siblings matter, and this is something that researchers should be studying more, as well as engaging with practitioners who are working directly with juveniles, because they are, in my view, the ones who are seeing the kinds of things that I'm not able to see in data sets. So I'd love your advice on what else I should be studying, on what other kinds of data sets I should be collecting. As the introduction mentioned, I spent a lot of my time collecting new data so I can study things that I can't study with available data sets. And then the second piece I'd like to give you is that the criminological focus on kind of one kind of outcome misses a lot. And I think in particular misses the experiences of sisters of criminally involved siblings as they grow older, and that there just is simply a lot more support we could give if we had more knowledge of more than one kind of outcome. So as I said, I'd love your feedback on what else I should be studying and what else, what I've missed in this short overview of that research. Okay, and I will stop there and hear questions and feedback. Thank you so much for spending your lunch with me.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. Yes, we've received several questions that we will go ahead and jump right into. And if you all continue to have questions as we're chatting, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will add them to the queue. So my first question for you, Sarah, is about language. So we've seen a shift in referring to the criminal justice system as the criminal legal system, right? So as a field of researchers, we're still using language such as offender. And so we're wondering, what efforts can researchers do to adapt person-first language?
Yeah, it's funny. I've gone back and read things that I wrote long ago where I actually don't, in my career, have not actually studied crime as much as I've studied incarceration, but I did use the term offender long ago, and certainly haven't used it since, but still offending. And I'm sure I said that in this talk. That I think is difficult, and I certainly adopt person-first language in my writing. The other thing, the reason I like the shift to criminal legal system contact is mostly because of what I study. I study inequality in family systems, and I don't view the state of criminal justice as one that involves a lot of justice at the height of the mass incarceration era. So the shift made sense for me, but I think also many people think of those things as relatively interchangeable. Um, my goal beyond that is to draw this distinction between involvement in crime and criminal legal system contact, because I think that also helps sort of humanize the people that we're talking about, and leads us to take seriously criminal behavior, but also take seriously our responses to it.
That makes sense. Okay, so getting into some of the questions about what do we do with this. So in risk and need assessments, would you suggest that sibling history of delinquency or system contact be weighted equal to parent system contact or engagement in delinquency, or should they be weighted separately and both be included?
So, I think I said a bunch of times that the research is not clear on that because there just isn't much of it. But we find effects that are quite similar in magnitude to parental incarceration. So to the degree that it makes sense to put parental characteristics and experiences in that kind of assessment, I think that one paper at least demonstrates that putting siblings in too would be important. So I think my answer is a qualified yes to that, but I think it also depends on what that assessment is being used for.
Fair enough. Okay, so I have a big why question, and then there's some other questions coming in that sort of relate to that. So are there factors that may explain why both the focal child and their siblings experience criminal legal system contact and delinquencies? And if so, what are some examples? So that big question of like, why are we seeing this happen?
So, I mean, I think that's one of the major issues with the data that we have available to us is that the why question is incredibly difficult to get at, right? So the number of studies that I read on sibling criminal offending overlap, there's some stuff on genetic influence. There's some, and most of it simply assumes a learning process. But what I find interesting is that all of the kind of parental incarceration stuff is really focused on strain. So shifts in the household on material insecurity, shifts in, and for me at least, the most important reason that parents and children both end up in the system is because they share similar disadvantages. And that is all the more the case for siblings. And to the extent that one sibling's involvement creates calamity for the child left in the household, that is, I think, critically important for understanding just how all of us find our way into trouble, and find ourselves experiencing greater or lesser attention from police, for example. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that families share experiences, and even if you don't end up in the system yourself, having a sibling who has that kind of experience, it seems unreasonable to argue that that wouldn't dramatically change your own circumstances.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, one of the questions that came in is about to what degree being known to law enforcement may impact, a sibling's contact with law enforcement because of, the focal child's contact with law enforcement. And that could also be related to sort of stigma more generally in terms of the community, neighbors, and things like that. Is there any
Yeah.
sort of potential research to examine that?
So one of my favorite studies, which was published in 1990, and it looks at that. But it's by Hagen and Poloni, and it's essentially about how labeling works within families. So I think yeah, there's some evidence that if you have a sibling that's involved, or drawing the attention of the police, other siblings, regardless of their behavior, are going to draw more attention. I think we need to worry about that. The other thing I would say is in terms of intervention, many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, had a prosecutor's office call me and ask about doing mentoring programs for the siblings of people they had just put in prison. And I was like, that's great, but oh my gosh, are you the last office that should be doing that, right? Because you just, so I mean, I think it also raises questions about, not simply whether greater surveillance of siblings is fair or reasonable, but also who should intervene for siblings who've experienced this kind of event in their family system. And I think that's something to be really careful about.
That makes sense. So we have a question about parentification. So what does research teach us about parentification of older children, especially Black and Brown children, and their possible impact on criminal legal system involvement or not?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's relevant. I'm not positive I can answer directly, but one of the reasons that we're interested in looking at racial and ethnic differences in these processes is because there do appear to be some population differences in how impactful siblings are. So there's been some research on whether friends or siblings are more important for understanding your own entry into drug use, for example. And that research has found that that white adolescents are much more affected by their peers, whereas Black adolescents are much more affected by their siblings. And to the extent that parentification is relevant there, I think my answer is I don't know. But I do think that losing a sibling to sort of serious criminal justice involvement does put added pressure on siblings left behind, and I would expect that process would be raced and classed in the ways that the parentification literature suggests. I don't know that to be the case, and again, that's something that is incredibly difficult to measure in any good data set. And just as a sidebar, Garrett and I wrote one of the papers that may have shown up in the chat as a review on this question, and where we essentially lay out all the open questions. And one thing that we found really interesting is just the utter lack of qualitative research in this space. Much of it is quantitative, including our own, and the kind of process that the question is interested in, which I think is critically important, is probably also a process best answered with deep, long-term qualitative work, and that's not happening in this literature either.
So related to that, I was thinking about that and also about the degree to which the relationship might be different in rural and urban areas, and how the relationship with the community, family, criminal legal system may function differently. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so relatedly, one thing we're looking at with the sort of in progress study is whether these processes play out differently in high incarceration places relative to low incarceration places. The urban rural divide, I'm not sure I have strong theories about, but I do think that the kinds of data that we have available to us just do not allow us to dive into complexity, right? We're always trying to estimate average effects, and that's just not how any of this works. And that's part of why I was asking you to think about your own relationships with siblings, because that last poll was forcing you to use one word to describe an incredibly complex relationship. So I'd be curious whether, say, perceptions of changes in social support differ across space, across places, which may have high rates of criminal legal system contact relative to low. Those kinds of questions I think are really important, but really difficult to answer. We have one national study that covers the entire country, but is sort of thin in any given place. And then we have, really rich data of kids in Chicago, but it's Chicago. And so those kinds of questions I think are really important. And just to sort of add to that, the part that I find really befuddling is, one could say, well, criminologists are interested in crime, or criminologists are interested in going to prison or in getting arrested or whatever, that's what we're interested in. So of course we don't have a bunch of studies that look at other outcomes. That our field is defined by that. But good gosh, we have tons of studies on parents and on friends that look at thousands of other outcomes. And the reason we do is because we created data sets in order to do that sort of work. And we really haven't with siblings. In my own life, I've interviewed many children who have parents incarcerated and talked, been in their homes, and I did the same thing. I sort of most of the time selected one child in the household, but there were always other kids wandering in and out of the interview, right? And in some cases, because for me at least, if a child wanted to participate, I didn't want to tell them they couldn't. So I would do interviews with multiple children. One that I remember is interviewing two brothers simultaneously, and they had radically different thoughts about their father's incarceration. And in fact, were arguing with each other during the interview. And so you could see the conflict that created for them. But in that study, I just have that one great interview, right? So I don't know to the extent that would be repeated over time, but the dynamic you could see in that interview is that they were pushing each other to extreme positions. And that's the case for many of our studies, that there are just so many kids sort of wandering in the background who don't end up with data collected on them. So those, sorry, that was a rant about how we're not collecting good data, but it's really frustrating. And we have on all sorts of other outcomes, and people who are not studying crime and punishment are certainly doing this.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier about sisters, like kind of ignoring the sisters. And we were wondering if your research is able to look at gender differences, sister to sister, brother to sister, and so on.
We are. Um, and I hesitate a little to tell you clear examples of that, because Bob and Garrett are currently arguing about how best to model that. But we're so I don't know once they resolve that argument. But we're actually finding more transmission among sisters in terms of crime, and we're finding somewhat different relationships with brothers, whether the outcome is criminal offending versus criminal legal system contact. So that's something we're digging into, and it's difficult to say, because it might just be that things have actually changed. And certainly, the way girls and women orient to all sorts of things have changed in the decades since people have studied this. Um, or it could be that we're just doing a better job of measuring things in detail. So I don't know which it is, but we are finding sisters to be important. The other thing I would say, though, where I think siblings kind of pop up as important, I can think of two examples. One is Megan Comfort's wonderful qualitative work that she's done over a period of years. And one of my favorite papers that she ever wrote was a paper that talked about how family sort of serves as caseworkers for their family members because we don't have the resources to provide that. And what comes out of that work is the extent to which mothers do all of this casework for their children, and at some point they age out of it and they pass it to sisters. So there's this incredible caring burden that sisters are doing to take the space of a social welfare system that isn't generous enough, not enough social workers. Sisters are there, and we're not studying them to any great degree. The second example that I can think of is Josh Page's wonderful work on bail bonds systems, and he actually worked as a bail bonds person and as a in a qualitative study, and talked about how they sort of prey on mothers to put up the bond because mothers are the one who will never leave the person behind. But sisters show up there too. So it's not girlfriends, it's mothers and sisters. And I think our research needs to pay much closer attention to those burdens because they're largely invisible.
Yeah. You had just actually mentioned aging out and when sisters take over. So one of the questions from the audience is asking if you can talk a bit more about the timing of sibling contact with the criminal legal system and age differences among siblings. So asking if there's periods in development where there's more impact on the focal child contact with the system, thinking about focal child is older versus younger and an age
Yeah.
gap.
So that's also something we're currently modeling. The classic research essentially finds that that criminal offending overlap between siblings typically happens between brothers who are close in age. So usually 2 to 3 years apart, and that the spillover typically comes from the older sibling to the younger. We are finding variation on that. And again, I hesitate to tell you sort of specifically because the models may change and we're really trying to get it right. But one thing that I would say is that part of family complexity that I think is really relevant here is the average spacing between siblings has grown quite a lot in the last several decades. And that's driven in part by people waiting longer to have kids and needing to try longer. I think that's also in part that we have more divorces and reconstituting of families, so more half siblings and step siblings. And so the question is, when those gaps get larger, do you see less overlap? And I think we're seeing less of that in the study that we're doing now. But that's critically important and I think another reason to study lots of outcomes, right? So what does it mean to have a sibling dramatically involved in criminal offending and the system when you're 10 versus when you're 20 and out of the house? I also think it's a good example of why we shouldn't simply focus on incarceration. In the parental incarceration sphere, there is some research to suggest, in general, research finds that parental incarceration is difficult for children, but there are some exceptions to that. So if your father, for example, is abusive to mom, kids are often better off when that father has left the household. Siblings, I think it works out a little differently. If a sibling is involved in crime and in contact with the criminal legal system, that actually might induce a very difficult sibling who is living outside the home to move back. So the processes are really different. And I think this sort of how does it work in this situation versus another? These are the kinds of ideas I'm really excited to get, and unfortunately can't give you clear answers on all of them.
I'm going to ask another question that's
Yeah.
probably, but for thought. So you mentioned qualitative work is lacking generally in the area. Does your group of collaborators take a participatory approach to crafting your research questions? In other words, do you talk to justice impacted siblings to have their take on what questions are more valuable for you to explore?
Yes, I mean, I have. And in some ways, this entire research stream is driven by those sort of one-off interviews, which is not the way one's supposed to do this, right? That I haven't specifically gone out and asked siblings what I should be asking about their relationships, but I also, in the interviews that I've done, they have routinely sort of brought up these kinds of dynamics. So for me, at least, we're trying to do basic things that with data sets that already exist. The next goal is likely to try and design a different data set, and certainly to do more qualitative work in which that would be a piece. But I think we need to be doing that, and it shouldn't just come up sort of in an interview I'm doing about something else, and that is how it happened for me.
Relatedly, so you mentioned racial differential impact by peers and siblings. And so we wonder if you could reflect on the possible impact of the pandemic year. So we know that the pandemic years had so many impacts on youth. When kids and teens, social contacts change deeply and things like that. If you could reflect or sort of share your thoughts on how that may impact peer and sibling differentials related to criminal legal system contact.
Oh gosh, that's a really hard one. That's a really good question and a really hard one. And I'm also trying to stick to sort of what I know versus what I think. But you know, I think as I hear that question, I think of it as an example of the kinds of things we should be studying, and how siblings are not sort of core, because one way to look at the pandemic is it removed peer influence to a great degree, but maybe increased sibling influence to a great degree. And so to the extent that someone might have been studying household systems before, through, and after that period, I would expect that you would see perhaps greater conflict in that household, perhaps greater learning processes in that household related to crime or criminal legal system contact. And that's the kind of thing we should be studying more. And I think, again, we just often tend to, you know, pick a focal child and maybe ask other people to report on how many other kids there are in the household, but we're not focusing on that sibling relationship, which is also, I mean, I guess I would also say what's interesting to me is that we're also only focused on adolescence for the most part, right? Because of what criminologists are interested in. But if you think about how your relationships with your own siblings might have changed over time, they are, my relationship with my older brother is dramatically different today at 47 than it was when I was 13 and he was 16. And so those sorts of relationships are with us longer. Our siblings are around in our lives for much longer than, say, our parents. And they're just not necessarily getting the same level of attention.
So I know that you had sort of identified the gaps in the research and like clearly identified that siblings are not being studied by researchers. I'm wondering what your perspective is on if these gaps exist primarily in research and it's known to practitioners and the criminal legal system and those working in the field, like, of course this exists. Or if you think in general, we're just sort of not acknowledging that this is a relationship that exists. So is the gap that we're minding, do you think primarily among researchers, or is it sort of more broad than that? That's a hard question. So
It is, and all I want to do is read the chat while we're talking, which I haven't been because I can't do six things at once. But that for me at least is why I'm so excited about this kind of a forum. Because my sense is that people who come to these lunch and learns I probably know a whole lot that I don't know, and so I don't know, but I do think that if you work in one kind of system, you probably see one kind of sibling relationship. Do you know what I mean? So if you're working in juvenile justice, you may often see one sibling come through and then another. Or you may often see brothers, for example, committing crime together, right? That may be something you see frequently. But you don't see the other kinds of relationships, right? You don't see the sister caring maybe that I talked about earlier. And that's also why I think studies that use administrative data that we have everyone's contacts with social workers and police officers and that sort of stuff. We only see the sibling if they come into contact, and so there's this real black box. And so I don't know, but I mean I will go read the chat after this because I would love to know whether whether this is mostly a researcher problem or whether the sort of lack of visibility of these relationships is common to other settings.
Yes. And we've been receiving lots in the chat, and I think that there's lots of I'll bring in as many questions and comments as possible. One of the questions was, when you mentioned siblings, and when you study siblings, are we talking specifically about biological siblings, or is that inclusive of adoptive, foster, like kin?
So in some data sets, it's actually unclear. So like in this first study that I showed you that I talked the most about, that is simply a caregiver reporting that a child's sibling had criminal legal system contact. And they can specify half sibling, they can specify step sibling, they often say just sibling. And so we don't actually know. In the study that's in progress, we can look at household rosters and get a much better sense of step, full biological sibling, age gaps between. Bob Apel's been spending 6 months trying to wrangle that data because it's incredibly complicated, and he just sort of sighs heavily whenever I ask him how it's going. So it's incredibly complex just as a data management. But I take the question, and I think it is critically important to just distinguish between those kinds of relationships, not frankly because I'm principally interested in the genetic determinants of behavior and their full siblings maybe matter more than step. That's I think an important question, but not one I'm interested in. I'm interested in those different kinds of relationships because they will usually imply different age gaps. They will usually mean that siblings are related to one another but may not live in the same household all the time. And so those sorts of relationships allow you to get some sense of how much time those siblings are spending together and how they're influencing one another.
Does this data in progress, project in progress, allow you to look beyond the dyadic, beyond two siblings?
Yes. So we're taking, yeah, no, he sighs heavily a lot. So we look at every possible dyad in the household. And each direction for each dyad. So if a household has 3 kids, for example, we're looking at the effect of each kid on every single other and vice versa. And I think that again is a really messy way to analyze things, but it does give us some sense of how much those relationships should matter, as well as how many kids are in the household should matter.
So we had a question from the audience about, from a practitioner, younger brothers often seem to feel an intense sense of deprivation and resentment towards older siblings, which seem to justify aggression. In your research, have you found that younger brothers are disproportionately arrested?
Yes, I mean, we have found that when older brothers are arrested, younger brothers are somewhat more likely to be arrested. In the first study, we find that if a sibling, and we're less able to distinguish age, but if a sibling is involved in the criminal legal system, we're seeing greater levels of aggression and delinquency in the younger sibling. So we are seeing that. I think it's the one thing that surprised me a little is that we don't see sort of depression and anxiety effects, but that's somewhat typical of the parental incarceration literature too. That some studies have found no relationship to internalizing problems. Other studies only find it when the kids get to be a certain age. My own work, I do find effects on anxiety and depression. But I think it's important to keep in mind that aggression is actually a pretty easy thing for a parent to report on. Anxiety, I think, is a little tougher to figure out in your 6 or 7-year-old or your 12-year-old. And so aggression and delinquency are just more easily measured things. So I tend to be more agnostic on that. And aggression in childhood is a pretty decent predictor of delinquency in adolescence. So I think those aggression findings are pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the last question that I have for you.
Yeah.
So how can practitioners share on-the-ground insights with researchers? Do you have thoughts on how we can mind that gap? So getting information from practitioners to researchers to sort of share thoughts, insights on research questions, things like that?
Well, it's funny. I'm thinking about my advisor whose entire life was sort of public criminology and sort of drilled that into my head when I was in grad school. So I don't know how you reach all researchers, but I very much hope you reach out to me. And there's a survey that will come out from the host, and I did add a question to that, which is please tell me what else I should know. So I really very much invite you to do that and tell me where I'm missing something, tell me where I might have it wrong, tell me where I should be focusing. Because I do think those, this webinar, right, is an amazing example of trying to create that kind of connection. But we're terrible at that. And I'm an introverted, researcher who likes to just sit at home and write my stuff, so I'm not great at it either. But I do think it's really important that we figure that out. And so I of course, love the sort of researcher practitioner partnerships. I'm seeing much more of that. I think that's important. But at least for me, when I say please email me or please tell me what I'm missing, I really do mean it. And I will be so excited to read the chat and see what I'm missing. So that's not a great answer, but it is, that feedback is welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we did not get to all of the questions or comments, but we will pass them on to Dr. Wakefield so the audience knows. Sara, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for taking the time to share this incredibly important information with all of us. But before I get to the closing announcements, I'll pass it back to you for your last thoughts.
I just again want to say that this kind of an opportunity is really special to me because it allows me to not only think about what I know, but also to be really clear about what I don't know. And so the kinds of questions that I'm getting make me think that this sort of research agenda is probably pretty important, but I also have so much more work to do and probably a lot of original data to collect. But I hope I've at least sort of, if you're a person who's been thinking about siblings as important, but unacknowledged, then I'm telling you, you're right. And if you're not thinking about siblings, but you now maybe will perhaps notice them in your work, that to me is mission accomplished. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful, thank you. So in a moment, we'll launch a poll question asking how much you agree or disagree with the statements. This webinar was informative and the webinar was engaging. Please answer these questions so we know how today's webinar went for you. While everyone is answering that question, I have a few announcements and items to put on everyone's radar. So immediately following this webinar, a survey should appear in the browser window you used to join today's webinar. Please complete the survey as it allows us to provide further feedback and questions for us. This information is also used to improve future webinar sessions. The survey should take no longer than 5 minutes, and we'll also put the link for the survey in the chat now. Sarah just mentioned she also added questions that will be helpful to her in future engagements. Please join us for our next Lunch and Learn webinar on Wednesday, November 20th with Dr. Richard Weisborn of Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Kennedy School of Government. He will be discussing teen and young adults' mental health, why so many teen and young adults lack meaning and purpose in their lives, and what are ways to cultivate meaning and purpose. Finally, if you've not already done so, please feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. Just as a reminder, the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of New York State Youth Justice Institute. In closing, I want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope you've gained something from today's webinar and continue to think about what Dr. Wakefield presented today. We look forward to seeing you at future YJI events.